Comment where you're watching from today. This story is about hope, perseverance, and how a single act of kindness can change someone's life forever. In the bustling halls of Harvard Law School, Lillian Hale stood frozen before her laptop, staring at her bank account balance. $312. That was all that remained after paying for her textbooks this semester. The warm autumn sunlight streaming through the library windows did nothing to ease the cold reality of her situation. Her scholarship covered tuition, but living expenses in Cambridge were drowning her in debt. The library hummed with the quiet energy of privilege, students in designer clothes typing on the latest MacBooks, discussing their summer internships at prestigious firms. Lillian pulled her threadbare sweater closer, trying to hide the coffee stain from her early morning shift at the campus cafe. The same cafe where, just hours ago, Celeste Hayes had complained about her latte being too hot while wearing a watch that could have paid for Lillian's entire semester's expenses. 3 years ago, Lillian had left her small hometown in Kentucky with nothing but perfect LSAT scores and a dream. Her father, a coal miner who had lost his job when the mines closed, had scraped together just enough for her bus ticket. "You'll make it, Lily," he had said, his calloused hands gripping hers. "You're the smartest person I know." Now, those words echoed hollowly as she faced the possibility of dropping out just months before graduation. The sound of laughter drew her attention to a group of students gathered around Rowan Blackwell, whose father was a senior partner at one of Boston's most prestigious law firms. "I can't believe some people here still work part-time jobs," he was saying, his voice carrying across the quiet study space. "Law school is hard enough without having to serve coffee. If you can't afford to focus entirely on your studies, maybe you should reconsider your career choice." Lillian's cheeks burned as several students glanced her way. They all knew she worked at the cafe. She had served most of them their morning coffee at some point. She began gathering her books, fighting back tears. This wasn't the first time she had heard such comments, but today they cut deeper than usual. As she hurried toward the exit, her worn backpack caught on a chair, spilling its contents across the floor. Her used textbooks, bought second-hand with highlighted passages from previous owners, scattered around her feet. The group's laughter grew louder as she knelt to gather her belongings. "Here, let me help you," a quiet voice said. Thea Whitaker, one of her classmates, knelt beside her, helping to collect the books. Unlike the others, Thea had always been kind, though they had never spoken much. "Don't let them get to you," she whispered. "They're not worth it." But it was too late. 3 years of holding it together, of working double shifts, of surviving on ramen noodles, of watching her classmates casually spend more on lunch than she made in a week, finally broke something inside Lillian. She grabbed her books and ran, barely making it to the bathroom before the tears started falling. She pulled out her phone, hands shaking as she dialed her father's number. It went straight to voicemail. He was probably still at work at the hardware store where he had found employment after the mines closed. "Dad," she choked out, "I don't think I can do this anymore. I'm not strong enough." That evening, Lillian sat in her tiny studio apartment, surrounded by job applications for paralegal positions. Maybe Rowan was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. The apartment was cold. She had been keeping the heat off to save money, and the smell of instant noodles hung in the air, a reminder of every sacrifice that still wasn't enough. She opened her laptop one last time to email her academic advisor about withdrawal procedures. But when she clicked on her inbox, there was an unexpected message waiting. The sender's name made her heart stop: Usha Vance. Everyone in the legal world knew that name. Usha Vance wasn't just a successful lawyer, she was a legend, known not only for her brilliant legal career but for her advocacy for first-generation students and her work in education reform. She had broken countless barriers, shattered glass ceilings, and now served as a federal judge. Lillian's hands trembled as she opened the email. How did Judge Vance even know who she was? The message was brief, but its impact would alter the course of Lillian's life forever. Dear Ms. Hale, your constitutional law professor, Dr. Sterling, shared with me your recent paper on equal protection in education law. Your analysis of systemic barriers in higher education wasn't just academically sound, it was deeply personal and powerful. It reminded me of my own struggles as a first-generation student and the many times I nearly gave up. I would like to meet with you this Friday at 2 p.m. in my chambers. There are some opportunities we should discuss. Regards, Judge Usha Vance. Lillian read the email 3 times, her heart pounding. Dr. Sterling had shared her paper. The same paper she had written during her breaks at the cafe, the one she had almost not submitted because she was too exhausted to proofread it one last time. She looked around her small apartment, at the stack of past due notices, at the empty instant noodle cups, at the second-hand textbooks. Then she looked back at the email from Judge Vance. For the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. What Lillian couldn't know, was that this email would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her life but would eventually impact the lives of countless other students like her. But that story was just beginning. The light of her laptop screen illuminated tears that were, for the first time in a long while, not of despair but of possibility. Outside her window, the Boston skyline twinkled with promise, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Have you ever received a message that changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring real-life stories that remind us that sometimes, when we're at our breaking point, help comes from the most unexpected places. The federal courthouse stood like a mountain of marble and justice against the crisp autumn sky. Lillian Hale arrived 45 minutes early, her only professional outfit freshly pressed, despite having to iron it in her tiny bathroom while the shower ran to steam out the wrinkles. She had spent her last dollars on a pair of second-hand heels from the consignment shop where Freya Lowell, another struggling student, worked part-time. The security guard, an older man with kind eyes, noticed her nervousness as she went through the metal detector. "First time here?" he asked, handing back her student ID. When Lillian mentioned Judge Vance's name, his expression softened. "Ah, you're in good hands. Judge Vance started out just like you know. Working her way through school, taking the bus, because she couldn't afford a car." In the elevator, Lillian's reflection in the polished brass doors showed a young woman trying desperately to look like she belonged. She had pulled her hair back into a neat bun, the way she had seen Valerie Holt, one of the top students in her class, wear hers during mock trials. But where Valerie exuded confidence born of privilege, Lillian's eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned early that life rarely offered second chances. The elevator opened directly into a reception area where Serena Banks, Judge Vance's clerk, was waiting. "Ms. Hale, the judge is ready for you." Serena's smile was genuine, lacking the condescension Lillian had grown accustomed to at law school. "She's been looking forward to meeting you." Judge Vance's chambers were not what Lillian had expected. Instead of the intimidating formality she had anticipated, the room felt almost welcoming. Bookshelves lined the walls, but between the legal texts were family photos and what looked like student artwork. A large window overlooked the city, and before it stood Judge Usha Vance herself. "Lillian," she said, turning with a warm smile. "Thank you for coming." She gestured to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "Please, sit. Would you like some tea?" I find it helps with difficult conversations. As Judge Vance prepared the tea, not having an assistant do it, but doing it herself, Lillian noticed the judge's hands. They were strong hands, marked with the subtle signs of years of hard work. These were not the manicured hands of someone who had been handed success. They were the hands of someone who had fought for every achievement. "Your paper," Judge Vance began, settling into her chair, "spoke to me on a deeply personal level. You wrote about the invisible barriers in education, the ones that don't show up in admissions criteria but shape every aspect of a student's experience. The way you described the exhaustion of constantly code switching, of trying to belong in two worlds while never fully fitting in either. It reminded me of my own journey." Lillian's hands tightened around the warm teacup. "I almost didn't submit it," she admitted. "Professor Sterling wanted us to write about constitutional theory, but I couldn't separate the law from the reality of living it." "That's exactly why it stood out." Judge Vance leaned forward. "Theory without context is just abstraction. But you brought it to life. You showed how equal protection under the law means nothing if students can't afford textbooks, if they're working 30 hours a week while their classmates are networking at cocktail parties." The judge paused, studying Lillian's face. "I understand you're considering leaving law school." Lillian's breath caught. "How did you?" "Dr. Sterling is concerned. She says you're one of her best students, but lately she's noticed something changing. The spark dimming." Judge Vance's voice was gentle but firm. "Would you tell me why?" The kindness in her voice almost undid Lillian completely. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I work every morning at the cafe, then classes all day. I study during my breaks, during the commute. Every free minute. But it's not enough. The networking events, the unpaid internships, the study groups I can't attend because I'm working. I'm falling behind, not in grades, but in all the things that actually get you a job after graduation. And the other students? How do they treat you?" Lillian thought of Rowan Blackwell's comments, of Celeste Hayes' sneers, of all the small daily humiliations. "They think if you have to work during law school, you don't belong here. That if you can't afford to fully immerse yourself in the experience, you're not committed enough." Judge Vance's expression darkened. "I know those attitudes well. When I was in law school, a professor told me that having to work showed a lack of proper priorities. The next day, I saw him praise a male student from a wealthy family for his admirable work ethic because he chose to work at his father's firm part-time." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "The law is supposed to be about justice, about evening the playing field. But too often, the legal profession itself perpetuates the very inequalities it claims to address." She turned back to Lillian. "That's why we need lawyers like you. Lawyers who understand these issues not from reading about them, but from living them." "But how?" Lillian's voice cracked. "I can barely make it to graduation. And even if I do, the big firms won't hire someone who didn't do unpaid internships or summer associate positions. That's where I come in." Judge Vance smiled. "I'm starting a program. A fellowship for students like you, brilliant minds who face systemic barriers. It includes a living stipend, mentorship, and guaranteed internship placement. But more importantly, it includes a support network of other students and professionals who have walked this path." Lillian sat very still, afraid to hope. "Why me?" "Because your paper showed me you understand something crucial, that changing the system requires both the knowledge of those who study it and the wisdom of those who have survived it." Judge Vance sat back down, her expression serious. "The fellowship isn't charity, Lillian. It's an investment in justice. And you wouldn't be alone. I've selected 4 other students from different law schools, including Freya Lowell from your own class. Freya, the quiet girl from the consignment shop who had helped Lillian find her interview shoes, who, Lillian now realized, must have been facing similar struggles. The fellowship would cover your living expenses for the remainder of law school and includes a guaranteed clerkship afterward. But it comes with responsibilities. You'll mentor future students, help develop the program, and commit to at least 3 years of public interest law after graduation. Judge Vance pulled out a folder. Everything is explained in here. Take it home, read it carefully. Talk to your family. You have until Monday to decide. As Lillian stood to leave, Judge Vance added, and Lillian? Remember something. When people like Rowan Blackwell say you don't belong here, they're right, but not in the way they think. You don't belong in their world of inherited privilege and assumed superiority. You belong in the world we're building. A world where justice isn't just a theory in a textbook, but a living, breathing reality. Walking out of the courthouse, Lillian felt the weight of the folder in her bag like a lifeline. The Boston afternoon had turned golden, the autumn light catching the edges of buildings and turning them to fire. She passed Rowan Blackwell's father's law firm, its imposing glass towers no longer seeming quite so intimidating. Her phone buzzed, a text from her father. How did it go, Lily? She looked up at the courthouse behind her, then down at the folder containing her possible future. For the first time in months, she smiled as she typed her reply. Dad, you won't believe what just happened. The story of how this meeting would transform not just Lillian's life, but the lives of countless others, was just beginning. But for now, she walked home with her head held high, no longer feeling like an imposter in the world she had fought so hard to enter. Have you ever met someone who changed the course of your life? Someone who saw your potential when you had almost given up hope? Share your story in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones that no one else can see, but there are always people who understand, who have walked the same path, and who are ready to reach back and help others forward. The news of Judge Vance's fellowship spread through Harvard Law School like wildfire. Lillian arrived at her morning shift at the cafe to find Thea Whitaker waiting for her, eyes bright with excitement. Is it true? She whispered as Lillian tied on her apron. About the fellowship? Lillian had barely nodded when the cafe door chimed. Rowan Blackwell strode in, followed by his usual entourage including Celeste Hayes and Victor Sloan. Their conversation died as they spotted Lillian behind the counter. For a moment, no one spoke. I'll take my usual, Rowan finally said, his tone carefully neutral. And I hear congratulations are in order. The words were polite, but his eyes were cold. Everyone knew that his father's firm had been trying to establish a connection with Judge Vance for years, without success. As Lillian prepared his complicated order, an extra hot oat milk latte with 3 shots and a precise amount of sugar-free caramel, she could hear them talking in low voices. Judge Vance must be losing her edge, Victor was saying, just loud enough to carry. Creating a charity program for baristas playing at being lawyers. Thea, still standing at the counter, turned sharply. Judge Vance chose Lillian because she's brilliant, not because she needs charity. Have you even read her paper on equal protection? Oh, I've read it, Celeste cut in, examining her manicured nails. It's exactly what you'd expect. A sob story masquerading as legal analysis. My father says this kind of social justice activism has no place in serious legal discourse. Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she worked the espresso machine, but her voice was steady. When she called out Rowan's order, this wasn't the cafe at all anymore, this was the first skirmish in a war she hadn't known she was fighting. Later that day, in constitutional law, Professor Sterling West made an announcement that silenced the whispers. As some of you may have heard, Judge Usha Vance is launching a groundbreaking fellowship program. What you may not know is that she has also agreed to be our commencement speaker this year. The classroom erupted in excited murmurs. Judge Vance rarely gave speeches, and her presence at graduation would attract attention from top firms and media outlets across the country. Furthermore, Professor West continued, she has requested that this year's moot court final focus on educational equity and access to legal education. The winning team will have the opportunity to present their arguments to her personally. Lillian felt the weight of several stares. Rowan's group huddled together immediately after class, shooting glances her way. She knew what they were thinking, that she had an unfair advantage, that she'd have inside access to Judge Vance's thinking. But it was Freya Lowell who approached her after class, still wearing her consignment shop name tag from her morning shift. We should team up, she said quietly. For moot court. We understand these issues in a way they never can. That evening, Lillian and Freya sat in the law library's quiet corner, surrounded by case law and statistics. Other students gave them a wide berth, whispering among themselves. But for the first time, Lillian didn't feel isolated by their attention. Look at this, Freya pointed to her laptop screen. I've been researching Judge Vance's career. 20 years ago, she faced exactly what we're facing now. The same dismissive attitudes, the same assumptions about lowering standards to accommodate non-traditional students. Lillian leaned in, reading the old newspaper article. It detailed how a young Usha Vance had challenged her law school's internship policies, arguing that unpaid positions discriminated against students who couldn't afford to work without compensation. She didn't just overcome the barriers, Lillian realized. She dismantled them for others. Their research was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Walker Jennings, one of Rowan's friends, stood awkwardly before their table. I wanted to ask you something, he said, glancing around to ensure no one was watching. My younger sister just got into law school. Our parents, they lost everything in a bad investment. She's thinking of declining admission because she can't afford it. I wondered if you might talk to her. The request stunned both Lillian and Freya. Walker had never spoken to either of them before. Looking at him now, they saw past the carefully maintained facade of privilege to someone struggling with his own family's sudden vulnerability. Of course we'll talk to her, Lillian said softly. That's the whole point of this fellowship. Breaking down the walls between people who need help and people who can offer it. As Walker walked away, Freya turned to Lillian with a determined expression. We need to make our moot court argument about more than just winning. We need to make it impossible for anyone to dismiss these issues again. They worked late into the night, fueled by vending machine coffee and a shared sense of purpose. Neither noticed Rowan Blackwell watching them from between the bookshelves, his expression unreadable. The next morning, Lillian arrived at the cafe to find an envelope waiting for her. Inside was a letter from Judge Vance, but this one wasn't just for her. It was a formal announcement of the fellowship program, along with statistics that confirmed what Lillian and Freya had felt. Instinctively, that countless brilliant potential lawyers were being lost to financial barriers and systemic inequities. But it was the last paragraph that made Lillian's heart race. The legal profession cannot claim to serve justice while perpetuating injustice in its own halls. This fellowship is not about charity. It is about transformation. About recognizing that true excellence in law requires diversity of experience, that the most profound legal insights often come from those who have faced the law's failures firsthand. As Lillian pinned the letter to the cafe's community board, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Among the statistics was a familiar name, Rowan Blackwell Sr., listed as having opposed similar initiatives 20 years ago when Judge Vance first proposed them. The cafe door chimed. Rowan walked in, saw the letter, and froze. For a moment, their eyes met. Across the counter. In his face, Lillian saw something unexpected, not anger, but fear. Fear that the world he had been prepared to inherit was changing. "Your usual?" she asked quietly. He nodded, then hesitated. "My father," he said finally, "he's not a bad person. He believes in maintaining standards." "So do we," Lillian replied, starting his drink. "We're just asking who gets to set those standards. And why?" The morning rush began, and soon the cafe was full of students discussing the upcoming moot court competition. Lillian heard snippets of conversations about educational equity, about systemic barriers, about transformation. The very topics that had once been dismissed as sob stories were now at the center of serious legal debate. During her break, she called her father. "Dad," she said, "remember how you always said one person can change everything? I don't think that's quite right. One person can start the change. But it takes a community to make it real." As she spoke, she watched Thea Whitaker deep in conversation with Walker Jennings, both of them reading the fellowship announcement. At another table, Freya was explaining something to a group of first-year students, her voice passionate and confident. Even Celeste Hayes sat alone in the corner, reading Judge Vance's letter with an expression of growing uncertainty. The revolution wasn't just about getting a seat at the table anymore. It was about building a bigger table, one where success wasn't measured by how well you fit into the old system, but by how effectively you could transform it. Have you ever been part of a movement that started small but grew beyond what anyone expected? Share your story in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single conversation, a single decision to stand up and say, "This is not good enough. We can do better. We must do better." The day of the moot court finals arrived with an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the brewing storm outside. Harvard Law School's historic courtroom was packed to capacity, with students, faculty, and practicing attorneys filling every available seat. At the center of it all sat Judge Usha Vance, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. Lillian stood at the podium, Freya beside her, facing not just their opponents, Rowan Blackwell and Victor Sloan, but a moment that would define far more than a competition. In the audience, she could see familiar faces, Thea Whitaker, Walker Jennings, and his sister, Professor Sterling West, and dozens of students from the cafe who had never shown interest in moot court before. "The question before us today," Lillian began, her voice steady, "is whether current legal education practices create unconstitutional barriers to entry for qualified candidates from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. But the real question is much simpler: can we claim to have equal justice under law when the path to becoming its guardians is itself unjust?" As she spoke, Lillian noticed something unexpected in Rowan's expression, not the usual dismissive confidence, but genuine attention. Next to him, Victor shuffled his papers nervously. "The statistics are clear," Freya continued their argument. 78% of law students come from the top quarter of socioeconomic backgrounds. Only 3% come from the bottom quarter. This isn't a reflection of merit, it's a reflection of means. Their argument wove together personal experience with constitutional law, statistical evidence with compelling narratives. They cited cases, but behind each citation was a story: Walker's sister's struggle, Thea's cousin who dropped out due to financial pressure, countless others who never even got the chance to try. When it was Rowan's turn to present the counter-argument, something extraordinary happened. He looked down at his prepared notes, then up at Judge Vance, and set them aside. Your Honor, he said, his voice different than anyone had ever heard it, I came here today prepared to argue that maintaining current standards is essential to the integrity of legal education. But integrity requires honesty, and honestly, I can no longer defend this position. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victor tried to tug at Rowan's sleeve, but he continued. My father built his career defending the status quo. I was raised to believe that success in law school was purely a matter of individual merit. But working on this case, researching these issues, I was wrong. We were wrong. Judge Vance leaned forward, her interest evident. Mr. Blackwell, are you conceding the argument? No, Your Honor. I'm transforming it. Instead of arguing against change, I want to argue for a more comprehensive change than even the plaintiffs propose. He turned to Lillian and Freya. They've shown us the problem. Let me help find the solution. What followed wasn't the typical moot court debate, it became a collaborative discussion about transforming legal education. Victor, left without his prepared opposition, sat down in defeat. But Rowan, Lillian, and Freya engaged in a point-counterpoint that built upon each other's arguments rather than tearing them down. Judge Vance's eyes sparkled as she watched the unprecedented scene unfold. This wasn't just a competition anymore, it was the future of legal education being reshaped in real time by the very students it would affect. In the end, Judge Vance stood to deliver her judgment. In my years on the bench, she began, I've seen countless arguments about change. Usually, they pit progress against tradition, reform against stability. Today, I witnessed something different, the moment when tradition and progress found common ground in the pursuit of justice. She looked at each of the participants in turn. Ms. Hale, Ms. Lowell, your argument was compelling not just in its legal reasoning but in its vision of what legal education could be. Mr. Blackwell, your willingness to question your own assumptions and adapt your position shows exactly the kind of intellectual honesty we need in the legal profession. The courtroom held its breath as she continued. There are no winners or losers today because today wasn't about winning. It was about transformation. And that transformation is already happening. She pulled out a folder. I have here a proposal, drafted by my colleagues and supported by a coalition of law schools and firms across the country. It expands the fellowship program nationally, requires paid internships at all participating firms, and establishes a mentorship network for first-generation law students. Looking directly at Rowan, she added, and the first firm to sign on, as of this morning, was Blackwell v. Associates. Rowan's shock was visible. My father called me last night, Judge Vance smiled. He said a certain barista's paper on equal protection made him reconsider some long-held positions. Sometimes, Mr. Blackwell, our children lead us to wisdom. The aftermath of that day rippled far beyond Harvard Law School. Lillian's paper was published in the Harvard Law Review with a foreword by Judge Vance. The fellowship program expanded to every major law school in the country. Rowan Blackwell, to everyone's surprise, turned down a position at his father's firm to work in educational advocacy. 1 month later, Lillian stood behind the cafe counter for her final shift. The regulars had all come to say goodbye, even Celeste Hayes, who ordered her first plain coffee ever and left a generous tip with a note, "Thank you for teaching me to see differently." Thea and Walker were there, discussing plans for a student advocacy group they were forming. Freya had already left her consignment shop job to coordinate the expanded fellowship program. And through the window, Lillian could see new faces arriving for law school tours, their expressions holding the same mix of hope and uncertainty she had felt 3 years ago. Professor Sterling West came in for her usual tea. "You know," she said, "when I sent your paper to Judge Vance, I hoped it might open a door for you. I never imagined it would open doors for so many others. Lillian looked around the cafe, at the students from different backgrounds sharing tables and ideas, at the fellowship announcements still pinned to the board, now covered in signatures of support, at the way things had shifted so dramatically in just a few months. "That's the thing about doors," she replied, thinking of her father's words from so long ago. "Once they're open, you can't control who walks through them. You can only welcome them when they do." On graduation day, Judge Vance's commencement speech was nothing like anyone expected. Instead of delivering it herself, she invited Lillian, Freya, Rowan, and other students to share their stories. One by one, they spoke about barriers broken, bridges built, and the ongoing work of making the law accessible to all who would serve it. Lillian's father sat in the audience, tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter speak. Next to him was Rowan's father, the two men finding unexpected common ground in their pride and their hope for the future their children were building. As Lillian received her diploma, she remembered that moment in her cold apartment, staring at her bank account, ready to give up. One email had changed everything, not just for her, but for an entire system that had needed change for far too long. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But as Lillian looked out at the sea of faces, some privileged, some struggling, all part of the same community now, she knew that the real transformation wasn't in the programs or policies. It was in the connections made, the perspectives changed, the barriers that fell when people chose to see each other as allies rather than adversaries. Have you ever witnessed a moment when everything changed? When people who seemed destined to be opponents became partners in progress? Share your story in the comments below. Remember, the greatest changes often happen not when we fight against each other, but when we decide to fight for each other. Because sometimes, it takes just one person to show us what's possible. But it takes all of us to make it real.